At 21:30 hours on September 13, 1942, Private First Class Walter Borak pressed his face into the mud of a foxhole on a jungle ridge in the Solomon Islands, listening to the sound of 3,000 Japanese deers screaming as they charged through the darkness toward his position. The ridge was about 1,000 eidolon covered in kunai grass that grew taller than a man's head. The jungle pressed in from both sides, dark and impenetrable. The humidity was suffocating, the air thick with the smell of rotting vegetation, cordite, and blood. Insects swarmed in clouds so dense they made breathing difficult. And somewhere in that darkness an army was coming to kill them all. Borak was 20 years old. He had been a Marine for 11 months. He had survived the landing on Tulagi 3 weeks earlier, survived Theodeli bombing raids on Henderson Field, survived the first night of Japanese attacks on this very ridge. Now he was about to face something worse. He was one of 840 men defending a narrow strip of high ground that stood between the Japanese army and Henderson Field, the only American airbase in the south. If the ridge fell tonight, the airfield would fall. If the airfield fell, 12,000 Marines on Guadalcanal would be cut off, surrounded, and annihilated. The entire American offensive in the Pacific would collapse before it had truly begun. The man, standing 20 yards behind Borak, silhouetted against the flash of artillery, was Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Austin Edson. The Marines called him Red Mike because of his carrot-colored hair, though the nickname had originally come from a red beard he had grown during his jungle fighting days in Nicaragua in the 1920s. He was 45 years old, a veteran of jungle fighting. In Nicaragua, where he had led Marines through some of the most brutal guerrilla warfare in American history, he commanded the 1st Marine Raider Battalion, one of the elite units in the United States Marine Corps. Edson was a small man, barely 5'7" in tall, with a soft voice that rarely rose above a conversational tone. He had earned his first Navy guerrillas in Nicaragua and his second just weeks earlier during the assault on Tulagi. Had it not looked like a warrior, he appeared almost shy, one correspondent noted, but beneath that quiet exterior was a core of absolute steel. Edson had spent years studying small unit tactics, jungle warfare, and the psychology of combat. He understood that battles were won not just by firepower, but by the willpower of the men doing the fighting, and he understood that men would follow a leader who shared their danger. In the next 6 hours, Edson would earn the Medal of Honor, but first, he had to hold a ridge that military doctrine said could not be held against the force attacking gate. The problem was simple mathematics. Edson had 840 men. Japanese Major General Kyoto Kawaguchi had brought 3,000 soldiers of his 35th Infantry Brigade through the jungle to take Henderson Field. The Japanese outnumbered the Americans nearly 4 to 1. They had more machine guns, more mortar, more grenades. They had been told the Marines were weak, sick, and demoralized. They had been told this attack would be easy. They were about to discover how wrong that intelligentsia was. To understand what happened on that ridge, you have to understand what Guadalcanal meant in September of 1942. You have to understand why this jungle-covered island in the middle of nowhere became the most contested piece of ground in the Pacific War. The Solomon Islands are a chain of volcanic islands, stretching southeast from New Guinea toward Australia. In 1942, most Americans could not have found them on a map. They were remote, malarial, covered in dense, tropical jungle, and seemingly worthless, but geography made them priceless. 9 months earlier, the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor and launched a campaign of conquest that swept across the Pacific like a typhoon. They had taken the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Wake Island, and Guam. They had pushed to the doorstep of Australia. The Japanese Empire now stretched across millions of square miles of ocean, and nothing seemed capable of stopping it. The American counteroffensive began on August 7, 1942, when the 1st Marine Division landed on a jungle-covered island in the Solomon chain called Guadalcanal. The Japanese had been building an airfield here. If completed, that airfield would allow Japanese bombers to cut the supply lines between America and Australia. The Marines captured the unfinished airstrip, completed it themselves, and named it Henderson Field after a Marine pilot killed at the Battle of Midway. Henderson Field became the most important piece of real estate in the Pacific. From that single airstrip carved out of the jungle, American planes could strike Japanese shipping, protect Allied convoys, and project power across the Solomon Islands. The aircraft operating from Henderson became known as the Cactus Air Force, named after the Allied code name for Guadalcanal. They were AMLY collection of Marine, Navy, and Army pilots flying whatever aircraft could be spared. Wildcat fighters, Dauntless dive bombers, and Army-era Cobras. The conditions at Henderson Field were brutal. The runway was little more than packed dirt and gravel, turning to mud when it rained and choking dust when the sun baked it dry. The pilots lived in flooded tents in a coconut grove called Mosquito Grove. Most contracted malaria, dysentery, or both. Japanese bombers attacked almost daily at noon. Japanese warships shelled the field at night, and every pilot who flew from Henderson knew he was operating at the edge of survival. But the Cactus Air Force dominated the skies during daylight hours. Their presence meant the Japanese could only reinforce Guadalcanal at night using fast destroyers that could dash in. unload troops, and escape for dawn brought American aircraft. This nocturnal supply line, which the Marines called the Tokyo Express, could deliver men, but not the heavy equipment needed for a major offensive. The Japanese understood this. They were determined to take Henderson Field back. Without it, they could not hold Guadalcanal. Without Guadalcanal, their expansion toward Australia would be stopped. Everything depended on capturing that air rest strip. The first Japanese counterattack came on August 21, 1942. Colonel Kona Ichiki led 900 soldiers in a frontal assault across a sandbar at the mouth of the Ilu River. Ichiki was a veteran officer who had participated in the infamous Marco Polo Bridge incident that sparked the Second Sino-Japanese War. He was confident, perhaps overconfident in his men's ability to overwhelm the Americans through sheer fighting spirit. The assault was a disaster. The Marines had positioned machine guns to cover the sandbar. When Ichiki's men charged across in the darkness, they ran into a wall of fire. The Japanese kept coming, wave after wave, climbing over the bodies of their fallen comrades. The Marines slaughtered them. By morning, more than 800 Japanese soldiers lay dead on the sandbar and in the surf. Ichiki burned his regimental colors to prevent their capture and shot. Only a handful of his men survived. The battle, which the Mariners called the Battle of the Tenaru, though it actually took place at the O River, proved that Japanese soldiers were not invincible. They could be stopped, they could be killed, but it also proved that they would fight to the death rather than surrender. There would be no easy victories on Guadalcanal. The Japanese high command learned nothing from this disaster. They believed Ichiki had failed because he did not have enough men. They decided to send Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi, was a career officer who had graduated from the Imperial Japanese Army Academy in 1914 and the Army Staff College in 1922. He had commanded the 35th Infantry Brigade through successful campaigns in Borneo and the Philippines. He was considered one of the most capable generals in the Japanese army. Unlike many Japanese officers of his era, Kawaguchi had a reputation for concern about his men's welfare. He had on Sijavan, a soldier assigned to a dangerous mission, a can of sardines that he had personally brought from Japan. But Kawaguchi was also stubborn and prone to ignoring orders he disagreed with. One historian noted that in his view, orders merely formed a handy agenda for discussion. This independent streak would contribute to the disaster that awaited him on Guadalcanal. In late August, Kawaguchi received orders to take his brigade to Guadalcanal and recapture Henderson Field. He was confident. Japanese intelligence told him there were only 2,000 Marines on the island. In reality, there were more than 11,000. This miscalculation would cost Kawaguchi everything. The Japanese began landing troops at 2 point about 20 mi west of the marine perimeter in late August and early September. They came at night on destroyers and barges, avoiding American aircraft that controlled the skies during daylight hours. The Mariners called these nightly supply runs the Tokyo Express. Getting troops to Guadalcanal was only half the challenge. On August 28, 600 of Kawaguchi's soldiers were loaded on T-4 destroyers for the run to Guadalcanal. American dive bombers from Henderson Field caught the convoy 70 minutes through the island. They sank one destroyer and badly damaged 2 others. 62 Japanese soldiers were killed. The survivors had to turn back without completing their mission. After that disaster, Kawaguchi switched to using barges for most of his troop movements. The barges were slower and could carry less cargo, but they were harder for aircraft to spot. Night after night, the Japanese fired soldiers and supplies to Taivu Point. By September 7, Kawaguchi had assembled approximately 5,200 troops at Taivu Point. He established his quarters there and began stockpiling supplies for the assault on Henderson Field. He was so confident of victory that, according to some accounts, he brought his dress white uniform to wear when he accepted the American surrender. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson had different plans. Edson had been watching the Japanese build-up with growing. Native scouts and Australian coast watchers had reported large numbers of Japanese troops moving through the jungle east of the marine perimeter. Edson studied aerial photographs and identified a likely avenue of approach, a narrow ridge running south from Henderson Field into the jungle. The ridge was about 1,000 yards long and dominated the surrounding terrain. If the Japanese attacked from the south, they would almost certainly come up that ridge. Edson shared his analysis with Colonel Gerald Thomas, the division operations officer. Thomas agreed. They took their concerns to Major General Alexander Vandergrift. The division Vandergrift was not convinced. He believed the main Japanese attack would come from a different, but Thomas persuaded him to let Edson move his raiders to the ridge as a rest position. It would get them out of the daily bombing pattern around the airfield. Thomas argued. On September 11th, 840 Marines of the 1st Raider Battalion and 1st Parachute Battalion took up positions on and around the ridge. The Para-Marines had suffered heavy casualties in the August landings on Tulagi and Gavutu and had been attached to Edson's command. Their commanding officer had been killed in that fighting, and they were now led by Captain Harry Torreson. A tough officero would prove his worth in the coming days. Together, these 840 men represented the only force between the jungle and Henderson Field. They were exhausted, many were sick, and they were about to face the fight of their lives. But they were Marines. They were raiders and paramarines, the elite of an elite. They would not run. But before Edson defended the ridge, he wanted to know exactly what he was facing. Intelligence from coast watchers and native scouts suggested a large Japanese force was gathering east of the perimeter, but the exact size and intentions remained unclear. Edson decided to find out for himself. On September 8, 1942, Edson launched a raid against the Japanese supply base at Tasameko near Taivu Point. 813 Marines landed from destroyer transports and converted tuna boats, catching the Japanese rearguard. The raid was supposed to be a quick heightened run attack against what intelligence estimated was a small rearguard force of 200 to 300 poorly equipped Japanese. The reality was as the raiders moved inland from the beach, they began finding evidence of a much larger force. Thousands of life preservers were arranged in neat rows along the shore, indicating a massive landing operation. Foxholes and slit trenches had been dug everywhere. The Marines found unattended 37mm anti-tank guns, suggesting the Japanese had moved inland quickly and enforced. The Japanese rear guard, about 300 men, fought hard to defend their They had 75mm artillery pieces firing point blank down the coastal road. Edson sent Company A under Captain Samuel Griffith on a wide flanking maneuver to the left while pinning the defenders with direct pressure. The fighting was intense. At tone point, Edson radioed to division headquarters, asking for reinforcements. The last part of his message was, "If not, request instructions regarding my embarkation." Division ordered Edson to break off the attack and withdraw. Red Mike ignored the order and kept attacking. By noon, Japanese resistance collapsed and the raiders swept into Tasameko village. What Edson found there confirmed his worst fears. The Japanese had stockpiled enough food, ammunition, and equipment for a major offensive. There were artillery pieces, medical supplies, and a powerful shortwave radio. Most importantly, there were documents. The raiders destroyed everything they could not carry. They burned food supplies, blew up ammunition dumps, and wrecked the radio equipment. They took several wounded Japanese prisoners and gathered stacks of. Then they withdrew to the beach and evacuated by boat, leaving Tasameko in flames behind them. Our morale was sky high after Tasameko, one raider remembered. We had kicked them hard and we knew they were coming. Captain Sherwood Moran, the division's Japanese language specialist, translated the captured papers that night. They revealed that at least 3,000 Japanese troops were cutting through the jungle toward the marine perimeter. Their objective was Henderson Field. Their route of approach was exactly what Edson had predicted, straight up the ridge from the south. Edson returned to division headquarters and briefed Vandergrift. "This is no MLY group of Japanese," he said. "They are well equipped and well led. They are coming." Vandergrift finally understood the threat. He ordered the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, to move into reserve positions behind Edson's lines. He positioned artillery from the 11th Marines where it could support a battery of 4 105mm howitzers from the 3rd Battalion. 11th Marines, under Lieutenant Colonel James Keating, moved to a location from which it could provide direct fire onto The stage was set. The Japanese were coming. The Marines were waiting. 3,000 Japanese soldiers against 840 Marines, nearly 4-to-1 odds. By all thorough of warfare, the defenders should have been overwhelmed. But warfare is not a mathematical equation. It is a contest of wills. And the men on that ridge had wheels of iron. On the afternoon of September 12th, Edson walked the ridge with his officers, positioning his men. The terrain was difficult. The ridge was shaped like a fish hook with several hills connected by saddles of lower ground. 3 hills dominated the position. Hill 80 stood at the southern end, closest to the jungle. Hill 123, the tallest, was about 600 yards to the north. Between them stretched a series of smaller NLs and depressions, covered in kunai grass that could hide in. Army Edson established his command post on Hill 123. From there he could see the entire length of the ridge. He could see Henderson Field behind him, the aircraft parked in their retreats, the control tower, the fuel dumps. Everything the Marines had fought and died for over the past 5 weeks was visible from that hilltop. Everything depended on holding it. The Marines dug foxholes and machine gun pits along the ridge and its flanking jungle. They had limited ammunition, only 1 or 2 grenades per man. They had been fighting, patrolling, and working for 5 weeks straight. Many were sick with malaria or dysentery. They were exhausted. At dusk, on September 12th, Japanese naval vessels began shelling the Marine positions. Then Kawaguchi's artillery opened fire. The bombardment was the Japanese infantry was coming. The first attack hit the Marines just after dark. Kawaguchi's 1st Battalion struck the right side of Edson's line, crashing into Company C of the raiders between the ridge and the Lunga River. The fighting was immediate and brutal. Japanese soldiers charged throughout the darkness, screaming bonsai. Marines fired into the muzzle flashes. Men died in foxholes. They would never leave. The sound of a bonsai charge was something Marines never forgot. Thousands of voices screaming in unison as men ran headlong into machine gun fire. The Japanese believed that spiritual force, what they called Seishin, could overcome any material disadvantage. They believed the Americans were soft, decadent, Unable to withstand the fury of Japanese warriors, they would attack with bayonets fixed, screaming their loyalty to the emperor, convinced that their fighting spirit will shatter the enemy's will. Against troops who broke and ran, the tactics sometimes worked. Against Marines who held their ground and kept firing, it was suicide. The Japanese pushed Company C back toward the ridge. At the same time, another Japanese force hit Company B of the Paramarines on the left side of the line. The Paramarines held initially, then began to give ground as the weight of the attack increased. By midnight, both flanks of Edson's line had been pushed back. Japanese soldiers had infiltrated the Marine positions, causing confusion and panic. Some Marines broke and ran toward the airfield. The line was crumbling. Edson appeared in the darkness, walking upright while other men hugged the ground. He grabbed fleeing Marines and turned them around. "Go back," he ordered. "The only thing the Japanese have that you do not have is guts." He reorganized shattered units, placed officers in command of mixed groups of raiders and paramarines, and stabilized the line. The Japanese attack slackened around 0100 RS. Kawaguchi had expected to break through quickly, but the terrain had scattered. His units had become lost in the jungle, unable to find their way to the assault positions. Guides became separated from the troops they were leading. Officers could not locate their subordinates in the darkness. The coordinated assault he planned had turned into a series of piecemeal attacks. He decided to regroup and try again the next night. Kawaguchi later said he felt disappointed and helpless because the jungle had scattered his brigade. But he remained confident. He had nearly broken through with a disorganized attack. Surely a coordinated assault the following night would succeed. The Marines, he believed, must be exhausted and demoralized. One more hard push would finish them. At dawn on September 13th, American aircraft and Marine artillery pounded the jungle south of the ridge. Edson used the daylight hours to reorganize his defenses. He pulled his line back about 400 yards to a shorter, more defensible position centered on Hill 123. He placed his remaining men in a line stretching 1,800 yards from the Lugar River across the ridge. The men were exhausted. They had fought all night. They had lost friends. They knew the Japanese would come again after dark in greater numbers and with greater fury. Late in the afternoon, Edson climbed in tow an empty grenade box and addressed his Marines. His voice was calm, almost conversational, the way he always spoke, but every man on that ridge heard him clearly. "You men have done a great job," he said, "and I have just one more thing to ask of you. Hold out just one more night. I know we have been without sleep a long time, but we expect another attack from them tonight, and they might come through here. I have every reason to believe that we will have reliefs here for all of us in the morning." The Marines looked at their commander. He was asking them to do the impossible, to hold against odds of nearly 4-1 with no sleep, little ammunition, and no guarantee of survival. Some of the men had not slept in 3 days. Some were so sick with malaria they could barely stand. Some had watched their best friends die the night before. All of them were afraid. But Red Mike Edson was asking, and Red Mike Edson had never let them down. He had led from the front at Tulagi. He had led from the front at Dama. He had been in the foxholes with them the night before, walking upright when other men cowered in their holes. If he believed they could hold, then maybe they could. They would give him one more night. The sun began to set behind Henderson Field, casting long shadows across the ridge. The jungle grew dark. Somewhere to the south, 3,000 Japanese soldiers were preparing for their final assault, and 840 Marines were waiting for them. The second night's attack began just after dark on September 13th. This time, Kawaguchi threw everything he had at the ridge. 3 full battalions surged out of the jungle, more than 2,500 men charging uphill into Marine positions. Rocket flares arced across the sky, illuminating the battlefield in flickering red light. Theflers cast moving shadows across the ridge, making it nearly impossible to distinguish friend from foe. In that house, the noise was overwhelming. Japanese soldiers screamed bands, rifles cracked, machine guns hammered in long bursts, grenades exploded with sharp cracks, mortar thumped, and their shells crashed among the foxholes. Officers shouted orders in English and Japanese. Wounded men screamed for medics. The jungle itself seemed to be in fire with muzzle flashes. The Japanese hit the right side of Edson's line first. Company B of the raiders, already weakened from the previous night's fighting, took the full weight of the assault. Japanese soldiers swarmed over the Marine foxholes, fighting with bayonets, swords, and rifle butts. Some Japanese officers carried samurai swords and used them in hand-to-hand combat. Company B began to fall back. At almost the same moment, another Japanese force struck Company B of the Paramarines on the left. The Paramarines had been battered the night before. They had started the battle with about 200 men. Now they were down to perhaps half that number. They were being asked to stop an assault by overwhelming numbers. They held for agonizing minutes, then began to withdraw under the pressure. A third Japanese battalion hit Company C of the Paramarines in the center. The line buckled. Marines were falling back across the ridge, some in organized withdrawal, others in near panic. Men stumbled through the darkness, tripping over bodies, losing contact with their units. The Japanese were breaking. This was the moment the battle nearly ended. If the Japanese had pressed their advantage, they might have overwhelmed the defenders and swept down to Henderson Field. The airbase was less than 1,000 yards away. Victory was within their grasp, but Edson was there. The lieutenant colonel appeared at the critical point of the line, walking calmly through fire that would have sent any rational man diving for cover. He was silhouetted against the flash of explosions, clearly visible to friend and enemy alike. He did not duck, he did not run. He walked among his men as if he were invulnerable, and his presence steadied them. He grabbed retreating Marines and pushed them back toward the enemy. His voice cut through the chaos, calm and commanding. With High Executive Officer Major Kenneth Bailey, he formed a new line just below the crest of Hill 123. "Get back up there," he shouted at his men. "The only thing they have that you do not have is guts." On Marine remembered Edson pointing toward the enemy and saying simply, "That is where they are. Go get them." Anatha remembered seeing him calmly lighting a cigarette while machine gun bullets cracked past his head. He was not showing off. He was showing his men that the enemy fire could be endured, that standing and fighting was possible. That battle was not lost. Major Bailey, despite a severe head wound that was bleeding down his face, led counter-attacks against Japanese soldiers who had penetrated the Marine positions. He rallied broken units, placed men in defensive positions, and fought hand-to-hand with enemy soldiers who got too close. Bailey would later receive Medal of Honor for his actions that night. He would be killed in action 2 weeks later at the Matonica River. The Marines reformed on Hill 123. They held a perimeter barely 200 yards across, surrounded on 3 sides by Japanese soldiers. The enemy was so close that Marines could hear their officers shouting commands. They could hear the click of bayonets being fixed to rifles. They could hear wounded Japanese crying out in the darkness. The fighting became a nightmare of muzzle flashes, screaming men, and exploding grenades in total darkness. Private First Class Robert Young Deere, a Cherokee from North Carolina, was hit in the face by a Japanese sniper's bullet during fighting, but somehow survived. Private First Class Walter Borak, the young Marine from the opening of this story, emptied his rifle, fixed his bayonet, and fought hand-to-hand when a Japanese soldier dropped into his foxhole. Borak held the man with his entrenching tool and kept fighting until dawn. These individual acts of courage, multiplied hundreds of times across the ridge, held the line. But it was Edson's leadership that held the men together. Edson stayed in the radio to the artillery. The forward observer with his unit had been wounded, so Edson called in the fire. "Drop at 50 and walk it back and forth across the ridge," he ordered. The 105mm howitzers of the 5th Battalion, 11th Marines, responded. The artilleryman fired 1992 rounds that night. They fired at ranges as short as 1,600 yards, dropping shells within 200 yards of the Marine lines. The explosions tore through the Japanese assault waves, shredding bodies and shattering formations. Each rocket flare the Japanese fired to signal their attacks became a point of reference for the American gunners. The Japanese kept coming. Wave after wave charged up the ridge, climbing over the bodies of their fallen comrades. They screamed, bonsai'd up. They fired their rifles and threw grenades. They died by the hundreds, and still they came. The Marines fought back with everything they had. When they ran out of ammunition, they fixed bayonets. When their bayonets broke, they used entrenching tools, knives, fists, and rocks. The fighting in the foxholes was medieval in its brutality. Men killed each other at arm's length in the darkness. Throughout the night, Edson was everywhere on the line. He positioned machine guns. He directed fire. He encouraged his Marines with his presence. He never took cover, never showed fear, never stopped leading. A combat correspondent later wrote that Edson was probably among the 5 finest combat commanders in all the United States Armed Forces. The crisis came around 0400 hours. The Japanese launched their final, most desperate assault. They had been attacking for nearly 7 hours. They had suffered catastrophic casualties. Their assault formations had been torn apart by artillery. Their dead and wounded lay in heaps on the slopes of the ridge. But they were so close to Henderson Field. They could see the aircraft parked on the runway. They could hear the generators that powered the airfield. One more push and victory would be theirs. Kawaguchi committed his last reserves. Officers led from the front, swords drawn, urging their men forward. The attack hit the Marine perimeter from 3 directions simultaneously. For a few terrible minutes, it seemed like nothing could stop them. The Marines on Hill 123 met them with fire from every weapon they had left. Men who had been fighting for hours, who had not slept in days, who had watched their friends die in the darkness, somehow found the strength to keep fighting. The artillery crashed among the Japanese formations. American fighters from the Cactus Air Force, the mixed group of Marine, Navy, and Army pilots flying from Henderson Field, strafed the enemy with machine guns and cannons. At first, light P-400-era Cobra Sand Wildcat fighters swept over the ridge, their guns tearing into the Japanese survivors. The Japanese could take no more. At around 0530 hours, as dawn began to break over Guadalcanal, Kawaguchi's surviving soldiers began to withdraw into the jungle. They left behind more than 600 dead on the slopes off the ridge. Another 600 were wounded. The assault had failed. The Marines held. When the sun rose on September 14th, the ridge was a curl house. Japanese bodies lay in heaps along the Marine positions. Some had fallen in clusters where artillery shells had caught them in the open. Others lay singly in foxholes where they had been killed in hand-to-hand combat. The smell of blood and cordite hung in the humid air. The ground was torn by shell craters and littered with spent brass, broken weapons, and the debris of battle. Flies swarmed over the dead, millions of them, their buzzing a constant drone that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. The tropical heat was already beginning its work on the bodies. Within hours, the stench would become unbearable. Burial details would have to work quickly. The Marines emerged from their foxholes, stunned that they had. Some wept openly, the tension of the night finally releasing in tears. Some laughed, an almost hysterical sound that had nothing to do with humor. Most simply stared at the destruction around them, trying to comprehend what they had endured. Many would later say that the evening of September 14th was when they truly understood what war was. Edson walked the ridge, checking on his men, counting the living and the dead. He had not slept in more than 40 hours. His uniform was filthy with mud and blood, but he moved among his Marines, thanking them, praising them, letting them know that what they had done mattered. The casualties told the story. The Marines had lost 57 killed and 232 wounded. About 20% of the force that had held the ridge was dead or wounded. The 1st Raider Battalion lost 40 killed and 123 wounded. The 1st Parachute Battalion lost 17 killed and 109 wounded. Some of the dead would never be identified. The intensity of the fighting, the darkness, and the confusion of battle meant that some Marines were lost without anyone seeing exactly what happened to them. 8 unidentifiable Americans were buried in the 1st Marine Division Cemetery on Guadalcanal after the battle. Years later, only one would remain unknown, but the Japanese losses were catastrophic. At least 600 dead on the ridge itself, with total casualties for the assault estimated between 800 and 500. Marine patrols moving south from the ridge in the following days found more bodies scattered through the jungle, men who had died of wounds while trying to retreat. The official Japanese records they became available after the war confirmed the scale of the disaster. Kawaguchi had lost a quarter of his attacking force in 2 nights of fighting. His brigade was shattered as an offensive force. The officers who hailed the assault waves were dead. The veterans who had survived Borneo and the Philippines lay rotting in the Cunag. The survivors were demoralized, exhausted, and running low on everything they needed to continue fighting. More importantly, Kawaguchi had failed. Henderson Field remained in American hands. The Cactus Air Force continued to flee. The Marines would not be driven into the sea. The news of the victory spread quickly through the American forces on Guadalcanal. For weeks, the Marines had been isolated, undersupplied, and They had wondered if anyone back home knew they were fighting, if anyone cared, if anyone was coming to help. The battle on the ridge proved they could win. They had faced the best the Japanese could throw at them and had. Our morale was sky high after that night. One raider remembered years later, "We knew we could beat them. We knew they were not supermen. They bled and died just like anybody else." That knowledge was worth more than a shipload of reinforcements. The Japanese response was confusion and Kawaguchi retreated through the jungle. His surviving soldiers sick, starving, and The march back to Japanese lines became a death march of its own. Men collapsed from malaria, dysentery, and exhaustion. Many who were too weak to continue were left behind to die. That jungle that had seemed like a concealed avenue of approach now became a green hell that consumed Kawaguchi's broken brick. The general himself walked for days through the jungle, his uniform torn, his staff scattered, his plans in ruin. When he finally reached Japanese lines, he had lost more men to disease and starvation during the retreat than he had lost in the battle itself. His brigade, which had landed on Guadalcanal with more than 5,000 men, was reduced to a remnant. Kawaguchi was later relieved of command for his failure, though he would serve in other capacities until the end of the war. He died in Japan in 1961, never having recovered from the humiliation of his defeat on the ridge. The strategic impact of the battle was enormous. The defeat at Edson's Ridge forced Japanese high command to make an agonizing choice. They could not support 2 major offensives simultaneously. Something had to give. Japanese forces on New Guinea, who had been within 30 miles of capturing Port Moresby, were ordered to halt their advance and withdraw. The men and supplies being sent to support them were diverted to Guadalcanal instead. Lieutenant General Harakichi Hyakutake, commander of the 17th Army, had been promised that he could have Guadalcanal and New Guinea both. Now he had Tochi. He chose Guadalcanal. The Japanese would never restart their drive toward Port Moresby. Their southern offensive had been stopped, not by a great fleet action or a massive army, but by 840 Marines on a ridge in the jungle. The ripple effects extended across the Pacific. Resources that might have been used elsewhere were sucked into the Guadalcanal campaign. Ships, planes, and men that Japan could not afford to lose were fed into the grinder of the Solomon Islands. The Japanese would try again to take Henderson Field. In late October, Lieutenant General Hyakutake himself came to Guadalcanal with fresh divisions for another assault. That attack, the battle for Henderson Field, would fail even more decisively than Kawaguchi's. By February 1943, the Japanese would evacuate their surviving troops from Guadalcanal. admitting defeat. But the turning point, the moment when the outcome truly hung in the balance, was September 13th and 14th, 1942. Those 2 nights on Edson's Ridge, Major General Alexander Vandergrift, the division commander, later said that Kawaguchi's assault on the ridge was the only time during the entire campaign he had doubts about the outcome. If the Japanese had broken through, Vandergrift admitted, we would have been in a pretty bad condition. Historian Richard Frank put it more starkly. The Japanese never came closer to victory on the island itself than in September 1942 on a ridge thrusting up from the jungle just south of the critical airfield, best known ever after as Bloody Ridge. But to the Marines who fought there, it would always be Edson's Ridge. It was named for the man who had predicted prepared the defense, and held the line when everything seemed lost. Red Mike Edson had asked his men for one more night, and they had given it to him. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson received the Medal of Honor for his actions on September 13th and 14th, 1942. Major General Alexander Vandergrift presented the medal in a ceremony in Australia in May 1943. Citation praised his extraordinary heroism and conspicuous intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty. It noted that after the airfield on Guadalcanal had been seized from the enemy, Edson, with a force of 800 men, was assigned to the occupation and defense of a ridge dominating the jungle on either side of the airport. Facing a formidable Japanese attack which, augmented by infiltration, had crashed through the front lines, he, by skillful handling of his troops, successfully withdrew his forward units to a reserve line with minimum casualties. The citation continued by describing how Edson had personally directed the defense of the reserve position against a fanatical foe of greatly superior numbers, continuously exposing himself to hostile fire throughout the night. By his astute leadership and gallant devotion to duty, it concluded he enabled his men, despite severe losses, to cling tenaciously to their position on the vital ridge, thereby retaining command not only of the Guadalcanal airfield, but also of the entire division's offensive installations in the surrounding area. Major Kenneth Bailey also received the Medal of Honor posthumously for his courage and leadership during the battle. Despite his head wound, Bailey had fought for more than 10 hours, inspiring his men and turning back Japanese penetrations at critical moments. He was killed 2 weeks later leading an attack at the Matanico River. In total, 21 awards were given for valor on the ridge, 2 Medals of Honor, and 19 Navy Crosses. 5 of those awards were. Edson went on to command the 5th Marine Regiment for the remainder of the Guadalcanal campaign. He led Marines at Tarawa and Saipan, earning a reputation as one of the finest combat leaders in the history of the Corps. A fellow officer wrote that officers and men would willingly follow him anywhere. The only problem was to keep up with him. Combat correspondent Richard Tregascus, who wrote the best-selling book Guadalcanal Diary, called Edson the best soldier I ever knew. After the war, Edson retired as a major general and served as the first commissioner of the Vermont Department of Public Safety and the Vermont State Police. He later became executive director of the National Rifle Association. He fought new battles in peacetime, campaigning to preserve the Marine Corps when some in Congress wanted to merge it into the Army. But the war never left him. Men who serve in combat carry it with them forever. The faces of the dead visit them in dreams. The sounds of battle echo in quiet moments. The guilt of surviving when others did not raise on them always. The end of Edson's story was tragic. On August 14, 1955, Merritt Austin Edson was found dead in his garage in Washington. He had died of carbon monoxide poisoning from his car's exhaust. He was 58 years old. The coroner ruled his death a suicide. Those who knew him were devastated, but not entirely surprised. Edson had struggled with depression for years. He had seen too much death, lost too many men, carried too many burdens. The war had taken something from him that could never be replaced. Some who knew him believed the weight of all he had seen and done in war had finally become too heavy to bear. In his final years, Edson had thrown himself into causes he believed in. He fought to preserve the Marine Corps against those who wanted to merge it into the Army. He worked tirelessly for the National Rifle Association. He seemed driven, unable to rest, as if he were trying to outrun something that could not be outrun. His death was a reminder that the wounds off were not always visible. Men who survive the battlefield sometimes carry damage that cannot be seen, scars on tussle that never fully heal. Red Mike Edson, one of the greatest combat leaders in American military history, could not escape the ghosts of all those jungle nights. He was buried in Arlington National Cemetery, Section 2, Site 4962-2. His wife, Ethel, is buried beside him. The Marines who fought on the ridge scattered across America after the war. They became farmers and factory workers, teachers and accountants, fathers and grandfathers. Most never talked much about what they had experienced. The memories were too painful, too personal, too difficult to explain to people who had not been there. They held reunions over the years. These surviving raiders, they gathered to remember their fallen brothers, to share stories that only they could understand, to keep alive the memory of what they had done. The reunions grew smaller each year as age and illness claimed the veterans one by one. In April 2015, the survivors of Edson's raiders held their final reunion at Quantico, Virginia. Only a handful of the original raiders remained alive. Colonel David Edson, Red Mike's grandson, and a Marine officer himself spoke at the ceremony. "They were men who answered the call when our nation was in desperate need," he said. "Their tenacity turned the tide in the Pacific. The last of the raiders who fought on the ridge are gone now. They joined their brothers who fell on that September night more than 80 years ago, but their story endures." The ridge itself returned to the foxholes filled with vegetation, the shell craters smoothed over, the kunai grass grew back taller on a man's head, hiding the scars of battle. The jungle reclaimed its own, as it always does in these islands. Today, a monument stands near the crest dedicated to the Marine raiders who served on Guadalcanal and in the Solomon Islands. It is a simple granite marker about 6 feet high with the symbol of the 1st Marine Raider Battalion carved into its face. It records that Lieutenant Colonel Merritt A. Edson, some 840 Marines of his 1st Raider Battalion and the 1st Parachuter Battalion who fought there, successfully defending this ridge for 2 consecutive nights from September 12th to September 14th, 1942. Monument lists the units that supported the Marines on the ridge. The artillery of the 11th Marines. The reinforcements from the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines who arrived on the morning of September 14th. The aircraft from Henderson Field that strafed the retreating Japanese. It records the casualties, the awards, the price paid for victory. 2 Medals of Honor and 19 Navy Crosses were earned by Marines for their valor on this ridge. The monument notes, 5 of these were posthumous, but monuments cannot capture what those men endured. They cannot convey the terror of fighting in total darkness against an enemy you could hear but not see. They cannot explain the desperate courage of men who kept fighting when every instinct told them to run. They cannot describe the bond between soldiers who face death together and somehow survive. That bond transcended rank, background, and personality. On the ridge, there were no distinctions between raiders and paramarines, between veterans and replacements, between officers and enlisted men. There were only Marines fighting and dying together in the darkness. At the Marine Corps Recruit Depot in San Diego, every recruit finishes their training with a 54-hour final examination called the Crucible. In the final stage, they scale a 700-feet mountain called the Reaper. At the peak, Edson's Medal of Honor citation is displayed. The recruits read it and are addressed about it. Then they receive a Theater Eagle, globe, and anchor emblems, becoming Marines. It is fitting that new Marines are introduced to their legacy through Edson's story. The battle on the ridge embodied everything the Marine Corps values: courage under fire, leadership by example, determination against impossible odds, and the refusal to give up even when victory seemed. These are not abstract concepts in the Marine Corps. They are living traditions passed down from generation to generation through stories like this one. Every young Marine who climbs the Reaper and reads Edson's citation becomes part of that tradition. They learned that Marines before them faced impossible situations and prevailed. They learned that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite fear. They learned that leadership means being the calmest person in the room when everything is falling apart. These lessons, forged in blood on a ridge in the Solomon Islands, shaped Marines to this day. 840 Marines held a ridge against 3,000 Japanese soldiers for 2 nights in September 1942. They were outgunned, outnumbered, exhausted, and afraid. They held anyway. They held because their commander They held because their brothers beside them were counting on them. They held because they were. The world knows that ridge is Bloody Ridge. The Marines who fought there call it Edson's Ridge, by any name. It remains one of the most extraordinary defensive stands in military history. A small force of determined men stopped an army and changed the course of a war. Red Mike Edson asked his Marines for one more night. They gave him 2. And in those 2 nights they proved that courage and leadership can overcome any odds, that a few hundred determined defenders can hold against thousands of attackers, and that the price of freedom is sometimes measured in blood on a jungle ridge 10,000 miles from home. The men who fought in that ridge are gone now. The last of the raiders who stood on Hill 123 has joined his brothers, but their story lives on, passed down through generations of Marines, remembered in monuments and histories told and retold to young men and women who will one day face their own moments of truth. What would you do if you were asked to hold a ridge against impossible odds? What would you do if everything depended on you refusing to give up? The Marines on Edson's Ridge faced those questions in the darkness of a September night in 1942. Their answer echoes across the they held. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. We would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania. From veterans to history enthusiasts, you are part of something special here. Thank you for watching.